Good afternoon, everyone. Casey, hopefully you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep, great.
You guys are all set.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar. It's 5 questions with Professor Tensie Whelan, hosted by the NYU Alumni Association. On behalf of the NYU Alumni Association, I want to first thank all of you for joining us today. We hope you're all staying safe, staying healthy in this time of uncertainty. We're very glad that you've chosen to spend some of your time today with us. As some of you may have already seen, today's session features Professor Tensie Whelan. Tensie is the clinical professor for the Business and Society program and the director of NYU Stern's Center for Sustainable Business. Tensie brings over 25 years of experience working at the local level, national and international level on environmental and sustainability issues. And she's definitely been at the forefront of engaging businesses in the prioritization of sustainability. I am Suma Swaminathan, and I'll be your moderator for the day. I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with Tensie in the capacity of an advisor to Stern's Center for Sustainable Business. I myself am an NYU Stern alum. I graduated in 2015, and currently I work in the impact investing industry. I'm on the private equity team at a firm called Developing World Markets, where I cover financial inclusion investments in Asia. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We expect that the webinar will run for 45 minutes. We think the interview, we'll keep that to 30 minutes or so and then leave time for Q&A after. You may have heard this already, but the session is being recorded. All attendees will be muted during the length of the webinar, but if there are any questions, please feel free to put them into that Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So on that note, Tensie, we are very excited to have you with us today, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think it'll be a fun one. If you're ready, shall we go ahead and get started with the questions?
Absolutely, and before we get started, I just want to say, is this echoing or is it just me?
Sounds well. Sounds okay to me.
Okay, good. I just heard that with you. So I just want to say thank you so much for being such a terrific advisor to us, as well as someone who is also available to our students and teaching our students on impact investing, and actually going to be teaching next week. So looking forward to that.
Thank you, Tensie.
Sorry to interrupt quickly. It's just a little echoey. Can maybe if each of you mute when the other is talking?
Sure, we'll do that. And so I've tried to structure the questions in a way that we talk about it as 5 different buckets, mainly looking at stakeholders who have an impact or are impacted by or have a role in sustainability at businesses. And these 5 broad buckets are across the businesses themselves, employees, consumers, we as a society, and then leaders. So I'll start off with the first one, which is business, the one which is most relevant, I think, to this topic and in this day and age, and to what we do at the Center for Sustainable Business too. But at a broad level, Tensie, what do you think the current crisis and its economic fallout, what it means in terms of prioritization of sustainability at corporations, and also more specifically whether this will force an evaluation of supply chains, whether that will be considered as well alongside it?
Thanks, Suma. Well, so I think, yes, absolutely. This is the focus on environmental, social, and governance issues by companies are only going to heighten. And there's a number of reasons for that. One, as we look at performance of companies who have good environmental, social, and governance or sustainability strategies, they have been outperforming conventional companies financially, right? So it turns out that doing good actually makes money. And so when we look at, for example, the S&P 500 in 2019, the ESG S&P 500 outperformed by 200 basis points over the conventional S&P 500. when we look in the last quarter, what we see is that ESG funds, ETFs, et cetera, are all of course, losing money like everybody else, but performing far less bad. So in other words, 60 to 70% of these in different asset classes are actually performing at the top levels of their asset class. And same with bonds. Actually, bonds are performing, green bonds are performing slightly better. So we're seeing that there's a connection that you wouldn't want to walk away from, given the coronavirus, between good sustainability performance and good financial performance. What are the reasons? What you find, and we at Center for Sustainable Business, as you know, we've been doing a lot of research around the return on sustainability investment, and indeed finding that those companies that embed sustainability core to their business strategy drive innovation, drive employee engagement, drive operational efficiency, risk mitigation, which is a big one right now, and also that they're better equipped to understand issues like, and you brought this up, supply chain, right? So when you've been focused on sustainability in your supply chain, you have to understand where everything's coming from, where are your highest risk suppliers, what are those risks, how are you mitigating against those risks? And those companies that have not been focused on sustainability have very little understanding of their supply chains. And so they've had to scramble to figure out where's stuff coming from, how are they gonna replace it, what are they gonna do about it? They don't have good relationships with their suppliers, they're transactional as opposed to partnership. So that's another reason there. So, you know, I think the other final note I would just leave on is that coronavirus, in a way, is, and I hate to put it this way, but in effect, it's warming us up for climate change. I mean, coronavirus is a compound growth problem, right? You have one death in week one, and you have tens and thousands several weeks later because of the exponential rate of growth. Climate change is exactly the same way. It also grows exponentially, and both of those problems are systemic. In other words, it ratchets it across the entire globe. It creates a sort of cascade of interconnected challenges, right? So that those companies that stay focused on being resilient for coronavirus will also being resilient for climate change are going to be better positioned for the world in front of us.
True, that actually does make a lot of sense. And even in the work that we've been doing, one of the ways we've been thinking about it is, you know, we see crises every 2 or 3 years, you know, in our markets, depending on what's happening. And resiliency is coming up as the one key term, either at the institutional level or even at the end beneficiary level. You brought up a really key point, I think, Tensie, on the link between this and climate change. So I'll jump ahead in the stakeholder list to the society part of it, because I think that's very related. Because the one thing our response has made evident is that we have the capabilities to coordinate our efforts at a national level, county level, at an international level, global, when we are faced with a problem like this. Now, what does that mean, or does it affect the way we as a society can evaluate our response to other crises, mainly, as you brought up, the climate change?
So it's taught us a number of things, right? One is that we can shut down our emissions overnight. All you have to do is look at the skies over Los Angeles or over certain parts of India, certain parts of China, and you see a night and day comparison overnight. It's taught us that we can mobilize $2 trillion to tackle a challenge overnight, right? You know, people were talking about on the campaign trail, Andrew Young was talking about universal basic income for everybody. And everybody said, no, that can never happen. It's way too expensive, blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, overnight, we have universal basic income for a period of time anyway, right? It taught us that we as individuals can change our behavior overnight, behavior that we thought we could never change, like sequestering ourselves in our homes and wearing masks and gloves and completely Zooming with our grandparents and, doing babysitting via Zoom and yoga via Zoom and doing all these things that we were like, no, we could never do that, right? So behavior change, is my point, can actually change overnight. So we look at that and we say, okay, it can be done. Sorry to all the naysayers, it can be done. So what's the path from here to there? Well, we are in, and it's going to get worse, a massive global recession, right? How are we going to get out of that recession? We're already seeing governments are going to throw a lot of money at it. Corporates need to figure out also a path to move themselves out of recession. How about we invest in green and resilient infrastructure? In Europe, they're actually calling for new plans that will actually create jobs around creating green and resilient to climate change infrastructure. What about all these factories that are idle right now and actually investing in retrofitting to reduce their energy emissions now when they're idle, right? What about creating new jobs for renewable energy or for a variety of other types of activities that we can retrain Americans or others globally who currently don't have skills to continue in a world where the economy has just tanked on them. So I think that there's sort of a couple of other points here. So one is that on the climate change front and water and other issues, social inequity, which we're going to talk about in a minute, really, really, really critical issues. The thing about climate change is this is the decisive decade. Just like that first month in the United States was the decisive month, right, for coronavirus, this is the decisive decade. It's right now where we're making the decisions that we'll see the increase in heat go like this to where we can't manage the outcomes, or this where over time maybe we can begin to manage the outcomes. Neither place we're in right now is going to be perfect. We're going to have major disruptions, but we can now make those investments that will at least reduce the pain, and the pain is going to be incredible, right? So currently, and like another just sort of some factoids here, we currently spend about 5% of global gross product on supporting fossil fuels and carbon pollution, right? $5 trillion. So the estimates are to tackle climate change, we need, or sorry, not 5 trillion, 5% of it. We need 1% of our global GDP to tackle climate change. No brainer, right? Particularly after what we've seen that, actually we can find the money when we need to. So I think there's a huge opportunity in terms of investment, in terms of consumer behavior, in terms of corporate behavior, in terms of government leadership to shift and use this crisis to help us sort of build more resiliency for the next crisis coming down the pipe soon.
I think that's one of the areas I've probably thought about the most too, is it does equip us with the toolkit maybe to respond to other crises, particularly focusing in on climate change. I think the one difference is the long-term nature of it. So if we are here trying to flatten the curve within weeks, but there we are talking about decades, and that I think necessitates behavioral change, which you've already brought up. So if we have time at the end, I'll cheat and maybe turn this into 5.5 questions with Professor Tensie Whelan and come back to it. But in the interest of time for now, I'll move on to the other stakeholders that, you alluded to, social inequality and inequity, and talking about the employees directly, as an investor as well on the equity side, where we are allowing or talking to our portfolio companies on a weekly basis, helping them address this, supporting them as they try and come up with initiatives for their employees and customers. One of the clear things the crisis has highlighted is the vulnerability of employees and jobs, particularly within the gig economy. Now, something needs to change, but the question is, what should change, and will it actually change given what we are seeing now?
So I always find sort of setting the context is helpful, because where we are now is the result of the path we've been on for the last 50 years of focusing on shareholder primacy over stakeholders in a corporate ecosystem. So today about 50% of, it's probably a bit under, but somewhere around there, of workers are actually before the crisis, but are low wage and about the equivalent number gig economy workers with no benefits. So, and there's a big overlap between the two, but not 100%. Those numbers have doubled in the last 10 years, right? And they've doubled partially because of a strategy by corporations to basically treat labor as an externality, get it off the books. Let's outsource it, offshore it, automate it, do everything what we can to not have it be on our books so that we can deliver more margin, more profits to shareholders at the expense, by the way, of workers. So I think we're reaping 50 years of bad strategy right now. And so those are the people most vulnerable. Those are some of the people that are frontline working to make sure that we can get our food and that we can be taken care of from a health perspective, who we are not paying, their health care or their retirement. I mean, basically all of the risks for the individual have been moved off of the company and onto the individual, which is just not American. If we're going to be like, it's not fair, right? That's just not equitable and not fair, and that shouldn't be an American way of approaching this. I don't think it's a global way, but I'm just to sort of speak to good old American values. I think it's a problematic one. And what we also see is that strategy of sort of pushing everything off to make money for the shareholder actually isn't necessarily a positive outcome for the shareholder, right? So I'll just give you a small example. So Walmart was rightly criticized for many years for disinvesting in its workers, right? No career development, no benefits, very little benefits, low wages, etc. And so what kind of experience did you have when you went into a Walmart store? Nobody wanted to talk to you. They were angry at being there. They were not good customer service people. So you weren't very happy being there. And so what Walmart started to see is a massive drop off in customer satisfaction and in sales and sort of significant financial impacts for them. And in doing the research, they realized, it's because their people are not happy and their people are communicating that to the customers. So they changed that all around pretty radically and increased the salaries, increased the career development plan, improved some of the challenges of the hours, the way they were set up. And lo and behold, customer satisfaction went up, same store sales went up. Financially, it was a lot better for them to make that investment in their workers to ensure that they had better in-store sales. So it's just an example of how we are very short-sighted in how we approach this. So what do we need moving forward, right? And also we need more research. So we at Stern at the Center for Sustainable Business are actually working with Just Capital, Arabesque, B Corporation to analyze and understand the correlation between quality jobs and corporate financial performance, so we can begin to better make this argument. But in terms of sort of very specific actions that companies and policymakers can make, we need the higher minimum wage. We just need to, we need to get there. We need to reduce outsourcing, right? We need to provide gig workers with benefits. In fact, we need a portable benefit program that can move with people wherever they move, that's affordable. We need reduced executive compensation that ties back better into kind of what everybody else is making. And we need incentives for the C-suite to actually manage better and support better their workers, right? As opposed to supporting only being rewarded on rewarding the shareholders. And I also personally think that, universal basic income is something interesting to look at, because there's a whole category of workers out there where it's very challenging to get them to if you look at all of the artists, right, and musicians, and to get them to where they need to be. So UBI could be something to look at as well. I probably have other things to say, but we'll just leave it right there.
Now, that was a comprehensive list of at least initial thoughts on what specifically can be done at a policy level. You did bring up the research that's being done with Just Capital, and I know that from my interaction with you and the team at the Center for Sustainable Business, there's already been some analysis and research that's been done on consumer patterns as it relates to sustainability. And so coming to the fourth group of stakeholders that I wanted to talk about, which was consumers, right? Us, all of us, really. And the current crisis with coronavirus, with what it has highlighted as the vulnerability in the economic situation of a number of livelihoods and financial stability and resilience, do you think the crisis will impact consumer behavior and whether that'll have an effect on the sustainable products that are being bought? Now, I'm careful about what I'm going to say here, but whether tough economic conditions will make sustainability, within double quotes, unaffordable, and is that a risk we foresee?
So Edelman Trust Barometer did an interesting survey asking people where do you stand on brands in terms of their behavior around the coronavirus. And what they found is that they would be, a majority of people would be very concerned if corporations were seen to be putting profit over workers, even at the expense of their financial health, right? And they also found that a third of Americans would gladly not only stop purchasing something that they from a company that they felt was behaving in a problematic way, but they would actually advise their friends to stop buying from that company. There was also a third that said we would be happy to buy from companies, we would make a special effort to buy from companies that were doing things in a positive way on the coronavirus. So let me marry that now with the research that we've done, as you alluded to, called the Sustainable Market Share Index, that we worked with IRI, which collects all of our barcode data at retail. So in the 7-Elevens and supermarkets, et cetera, everything on consumer packaged goods that we buy, which is right now, everybody's buying up madly, right? And what we found in looking over a 5-year period is that sustainability marketed products, while they're only about 16.6% of the market in total, represented about 50% of the growth. And for some categories, it was 150%. And across virtually all of the 40 categories we looked at, and we looked at 73,000 different products, virtually all of those categories, the sustainability marketed product was outperforming the non-sustainable, the conventional. We also, and this has not yet been released, we looked at the premiums being charged. And what we found was there was an average of about 39% premium being charged on those sustainable products. So you had that 50% growth along with a 39% premium. And now that's an average. So in some products you had a 0% premium and in some you had 150% premium, okay? But so, and I know through having worked with companies, the consumer packaged goods companies in my prior life, they are not, it is not costing them 39% to produce a sustainability marketed product. In fact, if they gave up 30% of that premium, they would still be making more money on that product. So what I hope and believe is that consumers will continue to look for those types of products that make them feel good about the company in this time when corporate leadership is really critical and they're paying attention. But they will be looking for the company not to gouge them at this time when it's so important, sort of difficult for people financially. And that indeed, I believe there's room for companies to continue to provide those sustainable products and also provide them at a fair price.
Yeah, that's actually a sentiment I completely agree with. And it's something I've seen in the work that we do as well. And in my earlier role within like the handloom industry, working with weavers, but there doesn't necessarily have to be this trade-off of sustainability, of course, being attached with a premium. It's obvious once you say it, but I still feel that a large part of the industry needs to work towards educating on that front. And maybe this is the opportunity where we'll see it. There's some people who've been, at the forefront of doing this already, and some we hope will pick up on it more at the corporation level now. And so that switches us over to the fifth stakeholder, or the fifth, let's say, influencer within the sustainability. And one of the key ones is the leaders in this space. So I think it was yesterday or day before yesterday, I was reading a news article about how at the country level leadership, I forget which news publication it was, but they profiled four leaders who've done really well in responding to the crisis, and being proactive was one of them. What was most heartening about that piece was that 3 of the 4 were women. Yeah, I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about, but it's at the business and the corporation level. Are there examples of 1 or 2 leaders who are steering their businesses through these difficult, challenging times and trying to smoothen it out, and whether an impact or a focus on sustainability has helped them do that?
Yeah, so when you look at corporate leadership today, I think it's comprised of 2 elements, right? It's a focus on creating stakeholder value versus shareholder value and societal purpose as the way to create profit. So I think we've all gotten confused about the means and the ends of things. And so companies are like, I need to create profit, as opposed to profit is an outcome of doing those 2 things well, right? Creating stakeholder value, which includes shareholders, and societal purpose. So when you look at 2 companies that have been doing that and are doing that, and sort of how they're interacting around the coronavirus, it's really interesting. There's more than 2, but quite a few. But sort of just take a look at Unilever, right? Who's had a track record, while not perfect, of making and following through on really significant commitments. 100% sustainable sourcing, having their environmental footprint, providing jobs to 500,000 small producers, ensuring that any new products have a positive contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals, building and working on brands that have a societal purpose, etc. In this crisis, their CEO, who's changed from the CEO who's one who led that initial work. So the interesting thing is this is staying, right? To me, it's also important that when you look at this, that it isn't just in one leader, because when he or she leaves, then what happens with that company? So the new CEO, first of all, he's announced that they are paying all of their workers and subcontractors for 3 months, everything normal that they would pay for them, which is unheard of, right? Whether they're working or not. They are also working on, they have a suite of products that are like soap, for example, which are really important for this crisis. So they're working particularly in emerging economies and developing economies to see how they can help really tackle the challenge. So they're looking at how they apply their skills as well. So I think there's an example of a company that is continuing to build on that sort of trust that they've societal purpose that they've embraced. Microsoft is another interesting one, sort of to take a completely different type of company. So they announced recently a massive climate change commitment, where they said they were going to go carbon negative by 2030. They committed to $1 billion fund to invest beyond themselves in technologies that would help everybody else, right? So this is also the type of thing you're looking for, right? Is it just about them, or is it trying to solve a broader problem? Similarly, they just announced on Earth Day a commitment to reducing their impacts on biodiversity and land, and creating, again, using their skills to create a planetary computer, they call it, that is going to help all types of businesses understand their impact on the natural environment and be able to better manage and reduce and mitigate against those problems. And then when you look at the coronavirus, they also have committed to having all their retail workers, anybody who's no longer working, paid full-time with healthcare, et cetera, right? And they're building COVID apps, right, to track people's interaction with people who might have had the coronavirus and things like that. So they're working, again, on taking their particular expertise and seeing how they can apply it to solving the challenges. So those are 2 that are kind of leading in terms of, they have a mindset of both managing for risk and opportunity and taking care of their people that you can see work before, but also that is clearly operative now. Then finally, I'd like to end this with just by saying, we as individuals can be leaders, right? When you look at the fact that in the United States, 1 in every $4 in this country is invested or engaged in some type of ESG investing, right? that there's 50% growth in sustainability marketed products. We can do this. We can change our behavior. We can buy less. We can buy better. We can build it back better. And it's incumbent on us to be those leaders that we need moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tensie. I think that covered all the questions that we had and gave us a lot of insights that we can take away. I really like the examples that you gave me also on Unilever and Microsoft. I think that's something I'm going to look into a little more as examples for what good leadership can look like. And you're right, it is something that needs to sustain going forward. And I think that is addressed by like the governance aspect of it within the ESG. I'll move to Q&A because I think we're doing quite well on time and we'll have a chance to answer some of these questions. I'm just going to open up the Q&A box right here. The first one, actually, it's a good segue from your last point on individuals as leaders, Tensie. It says, the question is, what are the best ways for us as individuals to put pressure on corporations and legislators to seek more sustainable methods and policies?
Great. Well, so on corporations, I think first is to make clear your displeasure with companies that are not being fair in how they're treating their employees. So if you see a company that's issuing a share buyback of $200 million while it's kicking out of work all of its people, you have something that you can write a letter to them about, and you can ask if you have investments. You can see how you can move your investments away from that company, right? So paying attention to some key companies, what they're doing, communicating your displeasure over bad behavior. Another, of course, is looking for in the marketplace and asking for sustainably produced products. So I made a pledge on a podcast once, as I love wine, to only drink organic or sustainable or biodynamic wine. And so now every restaurant I go to, I have to ask, and there's always a long conversation, and half the time they don't have it, and then I can't have it, but then everybody else at the table gets involved, and they all want to know about it. So it's, you know, it's those conversations, a little bit of work, but I think that's also important. The government side of things, you know, we have in the United States, you know, the Green New Deal, which doesn't look as radical as it did before, right? We have some really interesting work being done in Europe that we can think about how we might apply that here in terms of focusing on infrastructure and resilient infrastructure. So I think supporting those legislators that are coming up with both recommendations for financing to be stimulus funds to be invested in areas that will support environmentally and socially responsible and resilient investments, infrastructure, et cetera, I think would be another very important action to take. And then I also think that the, and I, you know, in the United States, I don't know how we deal with this now, but well, it's getting into another topic. I'm gonna stop there so we have more time for questions.
Okay, thank you. Let me take maybe one or two other questions. I'll go in order in which they've been presented here. So this is something we did talk about already when we were talking about the unaffordability, quote unquote, of sustainability for consumers. So the question says, what would you say to individuals who feel there's a cost barrier to buying sustainable products, you know, which may sometimes have a higher price tag, especially given the current economic instability?
Yeah, so, oops, we've got an echo again.
Oh, that's
great. So a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, we make our calculus about what we buy, not thinking about sustainability and long-termism, really. So, you know, for example, you can buy a couple of really cheap pairs of jeans or a couple of really cheap t-shirts, or you can buy a more expensive t-shirt or pair of jeans that is sustainable, that will last you for a longer period of time. And that's the way, you know, it was done 60, 70 years ago, as you focus more on durability. So I think, you know, one thing that we can do as consumers is say, all right, I don't need to buy a bunch of cheap stuff. Let me just spend that money on one more expensive thing that I'm gonna keep and use for a long time. Stay away from those sales that sort of make you buy, spend $5 on something, but many times on something that you don't need. The other thing I think is important for us to think about, I've heard people say to me, well, I don't really want to, I don't want to buy organic produce. It's too expensive. And then I look at what they're wearing and I said, well, like if you just didn't buy that blouse, that would cover your entire organic, premium of the organic purchasing for the entire year. So it's also a question of prioritization and where you're prioritizing your money. Also, there are a lot of sustainable products that you can buy that are not out there at a premium. You can buy a lot of FSC certified wood products that are pretty much at the same price. You can buy tea and coffee products that are certified as sustainable that aren't that much more expensive, maybe have a tiny premium. So it requires more work for you to find it. You can also buy a lot online that's cheaper. Whole Foods 365 organic line is much cheaper than all their stuff. So, if you pay attention, you can find cheaper alternatives. But for me, it's really about, how you manage your whole budget and making those choices in a way that is you buy less and spend more, but on those things that matter and that are good, healthy for you and your family and have durability.
Yeah, and I think this also goes back to, again, at the corporation level, it's fundamentally the question of whether it's both a risk mitigation strategy. We saw that with the fast fashion industry, 6-7 years ago now with the Rana Plaza collapse and the aftermath of that and the pressure that it put on fast fashion. And then I guess the similar takeaway is for other industries too, sustainable or not, it's more of, at a corporation level at least, it needs to be both a risk mitigation and a means for driving improved financial performance, which then ultimately I think gets reflected also in the consumer and our thought process to it. We may have time for one other question, I think. So let me just pull up one of these points. It says, what do you think are the biggest impediments to channeling investments into sustainable infrastructure? Political will, bankability of projects, lack of funds. What would be the biggest impediments?
Sorry, Suma, can you turn off your...
Yeah, my bad.
Mic, thank you. So it's probably multiple, but I think first and foremost, we need a federal framework for infrastructure, and sort of the same way we had the Conservation Corps during the Depression, right? We need a big picture strategy that's worked out both with state governments and with business leaders who will be delivering, the building of that infrastructure, and then also agreement around what kind of jobs, how do we train, how do we support people for those jobs, and how do we prioritize, right? You need a system for prioritization. But we have underinvested in infrastructure in this country for years. I mean, everything from our dams falling apart to our roads falling apart to us not being if you look at New York City, it's 90% impermeable concrete, which when you have extreme weather, you have a mess, right? And you can actually invest in permeable pavement and rain gardens, a variety of other things, right? So, looking at those kinds of things across the country needs a broad national strategic plan that is implemented and worked on with national governments and the private sector and investors. I think investors would be, there's a really huge market for green bonds, more demand than there is supply. I think there'd be a lot of money, long-term patient capital, institutional investor money, pension fund money that would be very interested in investing in infrastructure development, resilient and sustainable infrastructure development in this country.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Even at the international level, that's something we've been seeing in response to the current crisis. In the financial inclusion area that we worked with, it's a lot of the development financial institutions of these large governments that are coming together to, one, try and provide emergency funding effectively for building resilience at the institutions and providing liquidity, and two, making the effort to try and react quickly, which is I think imperative, even when you're talking about it at a national and international stage, because this is a fast-moving crisis. And so that's something else we've seen. I think it requires a coordinated effort at both stages. So I think that was a wide-ranging, very insightful conversation. Always a pleasure talking to you, Tensie. I want to take the opportunity to thank the audience who've joined the webinar. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope you found it useful. And thank you also to the NYU Alumni Association. Thanks, everyone.
My thanks as well. Thank you, Suma.
Thanks, Tensie.
Bye, everybody. Stay safe and healthy.